What happens when a decorated war hero, a brigadier general revered for his bravery, faces his greatest battle? Not on a distant battlefield, but on a quiet street, where a routine drive spirals into a confrontation that questions the very ideals he fought to protect. Before we dive into the story, please comment below where in the world you are watching from. The summer sun bathed the suburban streets in a golden glow as Brigadier General Anthony Reeves drove his navy blue sedan with quiet purpose. The car's hum matched the steady rhythm of his thoughts. Dressed in casual jeans and a crisp button-down shirt, the highly decorated officer was a stark contrast to his battlefield persona. Today wasn't about military accolades. It was about inspiration. Anthony, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a calm, commanding demeanor, was on his way to the local community center. He had been invited to speak to a group of young cadets about leadership, resilience, and the power of perseverance. His career had been a testament to those principles, a rise from humble beginnings to one of the most respected roles in the U.S. Army. The drive stirred emotions of pride and responsibility. His medals, tucked away at home, were a silent testament to decades of service. Yet, Anthony's thoughts weren't on past victories. Instead, they lingered on the future, on the cadets he hoped to inspire to lead with integrity and honor. Unbeknownst to him, the greatest challenge of the day wasn't behind the podium but waiting on a quiet street ahead, where the cost of dignity would soon be tested. The hum of the engine filled the silence as Brigadier General Anthony Reeves cruised down the quiet street, his thoughts preoccupied with the cadets awaiting his words. Suddenly, the flash of red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, shattering the calm. Anthony furrowed his brow, confused. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, and his car was in perfect order. With a measured breath, he guided his sedan to the side of the road, pulling over under the shade of a tall oak tree. He rolled down his window and placed both hands on the wheel, his military training kicking in instinctively. Stay calm. Stay composed. His heart quickened, but his face betrayed no emotion. The patrol car came to a screeching halt behind him. Officer Travis Harris emerged, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable, yet his eyes flickered with a hostility that Anthony couldn't ignore. The young, burly white officer walked toward Anthony's car, his hand resting just a little too close to his holstered weapon. License and registration, Travis barked, skipping any formalities. His tone was sharp, his words clipped. Anthony reached for his wallet slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. "Of course, officer," he said, his voice calm and steady, though inside he felt the unmistakable sting of suspicion. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Travis ignored the question, snatching the documents from Anthony's outstretched hand. His eyes scanned them briefly before looking back at Anthony, a flicker of disdain in his gaze. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded abruptly. Anthony froze. "Step out? May I ask what this is about?" "I said, step out of the car." Travis snapped, his voice rising as his hand moved closer to his holster. A chill ran through Anthony. He had faced insurgents on foreign soil, but this moment felt different. The hostility in the officer's tone wasn't just procedural, it felt personal. Anthony unclasped his seatbelt and opened the door slowly. As he stepped out, his tall frame and commanding presence filled the space, but Travis's glare didn't waver. "What's the issue here, officer?" Anthony asked, his voice measured, though his chest tightened with growing unease. "You were driving suspiciously," Travis sneered. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Anthony met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "I'm heading to the community center. I'm scheduled to speak there this afternoon." Travis's eyes narrowed as he circled the car, peering through the windows. "Got any drugs? Weapons? What's in the trunk?" Anthony's patience was wearing thin, but he remained composed. "No, officer. You're welcome to search, but I assure you there's nothing illegal in this vehicle." The crowd began to gather. Neighbors stopped on their porches, and a jogger slowed to watch. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. "Get on the ground," Travis suddenly barked, his voice thunderous. Anthony's heart raced. "Excuse me." "On the ground. Now," Travis shouted, his hand hovering over his gun. The weight of the moment hit Anthony like a punch. He had served his country with honor, yet here he was, on a quiet street in his own country, being treated like a criminal. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself to his knees, his pride intact but his heart heavy. Around him, the murmur of the growing crowd rose like an ominous tide. This was no routine stop. It was a battle for dignity, and it had just begun. Anthony Reeves, a man who had commanded troops under fire, now knelt on the hot asphalt, the heat seeping through his pants. Around him, the whispers of an uneasy crowd grew louder. Smartphones pointed his way, their tiny cameras capturing the stark humiliation of a decorated officer reduced to kneeling on a quiet suburban street. Yet Anthony's focus remained on Officer Travis Harris, who loomed over him with one hand on his gun and a sneer twisting his lips. "I said, lie down." Face to the ground, Travis barked, his tone harsh and uncompromising. Anthony looked up at the officer, his deep, steady voice cutting through the tension. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm kneeling, but I won't lay flat on the ground like a criminal without cause." Travis's face reddened, his grip on his holstered weapon tightening. "You don't get to decide. I said down." Anthony's jaw clenched, his breath steady but strained. The weight of decades of discipline kept him calm, even as anger simmered in his chest. He straightened slightly, his back tall even in a kneeling position. "I am Brigadier General Anthony Reeves of the United States Army. I have served this country with honor. What justification do you have for this treatment?" The declaration hung in the air, silencing the murmurs of the crowd for a moment. But it did nothing to sway Travis, whose sneer only deepened. "You think that uniform makes you special," he hissed. "Out here, it doesn't mean anything." Anthony felt the sting of the words, but he refused to let them show. Around him, the crowd began to murmur again. A middle-aged woman called out, "Hey, what's he done? Leave him alone." Another voice, younger and sharper, yelled, "That's not right." But Travis ignored the voices, his eyes locked on Anthony as if daring him to challenge his authority. "What's in the car?" Travis demanded again. "Drugs, weapons, something you don't want me to find." "There is nothing illegal in my car," Anthony replied firmly. "I'll decide that." Travis reached for his radio. Backup requested. Possible suspect with unknown contraband. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, outrage bubbling up as Anthony remained still, his hands raised slightly in a show of compliance. "This is wrong," someone shouted. Another voice chimed in. "Why are you treating him like this?" The weight of the moment pressed on Anthony, not just from Travis's aggression but from the eyes of the onlookers. He could feel their collective anger, fear, and helplessness. He had led men into battle, faced enemies with weapons drawn, but this, being reduced to a stereotype in his own country, cut deeper than any wound. Travis bent down, his knee pressing into Anthony's back, forcing him closer to the ground. Anthony winced, the pressure sharp against his spine. "Stay down," Travis growled, his voice low but menacing. "Hey!" a man from the crowd shouted. "You can't do that." "He's not resisting." But Travis didn't even glance up. His focus was solely on Anthony, his actions fueled by a blend of fear, authority, and prejudice. "Officer, I am not a threat," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the strain. "You're escalating a situation that didn't need to exist." Travis leaned closer, his breath hot and acrid. "You think you're better than me? You think I don't know your type? Trying to act like you're innocent, like you belong here." Anthony didn't respond. He knew better than to argue with someone blinded by their own hatred. Instead, he turned his focus inward, drawing on the same resilience that had carried him through years of combat. As the tension built, the crowd grew bolder. A young man in a hoodie stepped closer, his phone held high. "You're gonna regret this, man," he said to Travis. "The whole world's watching." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Travis's face, but it was fleeting. "Step back," he barked at the crowd, one hand gesturing toward them while the other remained on his gun. "Enough," a woman's voice rang out, strong and clear. All heads turned as another police car screeched to a stop at the scene. Out stepped Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, her crisp uniform and commanding presence cutting through the chaos. A black woman in her 40s with a reputation for fairness and authority, she strode toward the scene, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Officer Harris, "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the crowd. Travis stood up quickly, his knee leaving Anthony's back. "Lieutenant, this man was acting suspiciously. I was conducting a search." Monroe's eyes narrowed as she glanced at Anthony, recognizing him immediately. "Suspicious? This is Brigadier General Anthony Reeves." Her voice dropped, her tone icy with disbelief. "What exactly made him suspicious?" Travis stammered, his confidence faltering. He was driving in the neighborhood, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Monroe interrupted, her voice sharp. "That he didn't belong? Did you even ask for his identification before escalating this?" Travis looked away, his hands twitching nervously. Monroe turned to Anthony, her expression softening. "General Reeves, are you all right?" Anthony rose slowly, his body aching but his pride intact. He dusted off his pants and nodded. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. Thank you for intervening." Monroe's gaze hardened as she turned back to Travis. "Officer Harris, you've crossed every line of protocol and decency. Hand over your badge and weapon. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Travis's face drained of color. "Lieutenant, please, I didn't." "Now," Monroe barked. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing down the street. Some clapped, others shouted words of encouragement to Anthony. The energy shifted, the earlier tension giving way to a sense of justice being served. Anthony, standing tall despite his bruises, turned to the crowd. His voice was calm but firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about what's wrong with the system. This could have been anyone. We need to hold ourselves and each other accountable." The applause grew louder, the weight of his words resonating with the onlookers. Monroe stepped closer to Anthony, her voice low. "General, I deeply apologize for what happened today. I'll make sure this is addressed properly." Anthony nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Lieutenant. But this is bigger than one officer. The system needs to change." As Monroe led Travis away, the crowd parted to let Anthony return to his car. The moment was over, but the scars it left would remain, on Anthony, on the crowd, and perhaps even on Officer Harris, who now faced the consequences of his actions. Anthony sat behind the wheel for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He drew a deep breath, the echoes of the confrontation still ringing in his ears. Then, with quiet determination, he started the engine and drove away, ready to turn this moment of injustice into a call for lasting change. The tension in the air was suffocating, thickened by the heated whispers of the growing crowd. Brigadier General Anthony Reeves stood tall despite the humiliation he had just endured. His chest ached from where Officer Travis Harris had pressed his knee, and his pride, though resilient, bore the weight of injustice. He had fought enemies on foreign soil, but this battle, a fight for his dignity in his own homeland, cut deeper than any wound. Just as the moment teetered on the edge of chaos, the piercing wail of another siren shattered the uneasy silence. A second patrol car screeched to a stop, and out stepped Lieutenant Rachel Monroe. Her presence was a force in itself, sharp-eyed, calm, and resolute. The crowd instinctively parted for her, their murmurs shifting to a hushed anticipation. Rachel, a seasoned officer in her 40s, carried the weight of both authority and empathy. A black woman who had risen through the ranks despite the odds, she was no stranger to navigating a world of prejudice and systemic flaws. Her gaze swept over the scene, the rattled crowd, Anthony's bruised dignity, and Travis's nervous stance, and it didn't take long for her to piece together the situation. "Officer Harris," she called, her voice steady but commanding. "What exactly is going on here?" Travis straightened, his face pale. "This man was acting suspiciously, Lieutenant. I was conducting a lawful stop." Rachel's sharp eyes flicked to Anthony, and recognition sparked immediately. She had met him once, years ago, during a military police collaborative training. Her voice turned cold. "Suspicious? This is Brigadier General Anthony Reeves, a decorated officer of the United States Army. What exactly made him suspicious?" Travis stammered, his earlier confidence unraveling. He was driving in the neighborhood, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Rachel cut him off, her tone slicing through his excuses. That he didn't belong? Did you even ask for his identification before escalating this situation? Did you follow any procedure at all? Travis's mouth opened and closed, his words failing him. His hand fell from his holster, trembling now as the weight of Rachel's authority bore down on him. Rachel turned to Anthony, her expression softening. "General Reeves, are you all right?" Anthony nodded, his composure unwavering. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. Thank you for stepping in." Rachel's jaw tightened as she turned back to Travis. Her voice, now louder for the benefit of the crowd, carried the weight of accountability. "Officer Harris, you've crossed every line. You've not only violated protocol but disgraced the badge you wear. Hand over your weapon and badge. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Travis's face drained of color. "Lieutenant, please, I didn't mean." "Now," Rachel barked, her voice ringing with finality. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers reverberating through the street. Smartphones captured every second, their lenses trained on the scene like a spotlight. Some shouted words of encouragement to Anthony, while others jeered at Travis, their anger directed at the injustice they had witnessed. Rachel's focus never wavered. She approached Anthony, her tone lowering as she addressed him directly. "General, I deeply apologize for what happened here today. I assure you, this will be dealt with swiftly and thoroughly." "You have my word." Anthony nodded, his expression calm but tinged with sadness. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your intervention. But this isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows this to happen in the first place." Rachel met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She turned to address the crowd, her voice clear and steady. "This kind of behavior has no place in law enforcement. It's up to all of us, officers and citizens alike, to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Today's incident is a reminder of how much work we have to do." As the crowd cheered once more, Rachel turned back to Travis, who now stood frozen, his badge and weapon handed over. His shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of shame. Anthony took a deep breath and glanced at the people around him, faces filled with both anger and hope. He straightened his posture, the general in him rising once more. Despite the bruises, both physical and emotional, he had emerged unbroken. As Rachel led Travis away, Anthony walked to his car, his steps slow but deliberate. The battle had been won, but the war, against prejudice, against systemic failures, was far from over. He drove off, carrying with him the resolve to turn this moment into a catalyst for change. As Brigadier General Anthony Reeves drove away from the scene, the cheers of the crowd and the memory of Lieutenant Rachel Monroe's swift action echoed in his mind. The road ahead stretched out under the warm sun, but Anthony's heart was heavy with emotions he hadn't expected to confront. He had faced danger in war zones, but the battlefield of prejudice in his own country was a wound that cut deeper than any he had endured overseas. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the confrontation. The hot pavement pressing into his knees, Officer Travis Harris's sneering accusations, and the weight of humiliation, it all lingered, an indelible mark on his soul. Anthony had worn the uniform of the United States Army with pride, a symbol of his sacrifice and service. But today, none of it had mattered. His medals, his rank, his years of dedication, they were invisible beneath the color of his skin. In the rearview mirror, he glimpsed the outline of the neighborhood he'd just left behind, now filled with onlookers and flashing lights. He knew the videos captured by the crowd would soon circulate, igniting conversations about race, justice, and authority. But for Anthony, this was not just about a single encounter. It was a reminder of the systemic rot that persisted. His thoughts turned to his family. What would his wife and children say if they saw the footage? His children had grown up hearing his stories of valor, tales of leadership and bravery. Would they now see their father as a victim of the same injustice he had fought to protect them from? Would his wife, always his pillar of strength, share his sadness or feel the same helpless anger he struggled to suppress? Anthony pulled into a quiet parking lot and turned off the engine. For a moment, he sat in silence, his reflection staring back at him in the rear-view mirror. He had fought for the ideals of freedom and equality, yet today he felt the sharp sting of their absence. The system he had sworn to protect had turned against him in an instant, reducing him to a stereotype, a target for suspicion and hostility. His mind wrestled with conflicting emotions. There was anger, raw and undeniable, at being stripped of his dignity. There was sadness, too, a deep sorrow for the countless others who had faced the same prejudice without the privilege of a crowd or a Lieutenant Monroe to intervene. But above all, there was a resolve, a quiet determination to turn this moment into something greater. Anthony reached for his phone, scrolling through his notes for the speech he was about to deliver at the community center. The words he had prepared now felt hollow, detached from the reality he had just experienced. He deleted them all and began anew. His message wouldn't just be about leadership, it would be about resilience, justice, and the courage to confront prejudice head-on. Today wasn't just a painful moment in his life, it was a call to action. And Anthony Reeves, a soldier to his core, knew how to answer. The hall fell silent as Lieutenant Rachel Monroe stood firmly before the crowd. Facing her was Officer Travis Harris, stripped of his badge and weapon. His shoulders slumped under the weight of shame. The tension in the air was palpable, the murmurs of onlookers stilled as they awaited what was to come. "Officer Harris," Monroe began, her voice steady and cold, "you owe General Anthony Reeves and everyone here an apology. Loud enough for all to hear." Travis's hands trembled at his sides as he swallowed hard. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Monroe and Anthony, who stood tall and calm despite the events that had unfolded. Finally, with a shaky breath, Travis spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I made a mistake." "That's not good enough," Monroe snapped, her tone cutting. "Speak up. Own what you've done." Travis's voice grew louder, the weight of his actions evident in every word. "I'm sorry, General Reeves. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I acted unfairly and treated you with disrespect. I'm sorry." The crowd murmured, their emotions mixed, some filled with anger, others nodding at the admission. Anthony met Travis's gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet strength, he stepped forward. "Apologies are the first step," Anthony said, his voice firm. "But actions must follow. Learn from this, change, so no one else has to endure what I did today." The crowd erupted into applause. As Brigadier General Anthony Reeves entered the community center, the weight of the day still hung heavily on his shoulders. The hall was abuzz with young cadets and their families, eager to hear his words of wisdom. But Anthony's focus wasn't on the speech he had originally prepared, it was on the encounter that had tested his dignity just hours earlier. Walking to the podium, he paused, scanning the room. Faces full of admiration and curiosity stared back at him. He took a deep breath and began. "Today, I had an experience that reminded me of why leadership and integrity are so important," he started, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was stopped on my way here, not for anything I had done, but because of what someone assumed about me. Despite my rank, my service, and the uniform I've worn with pride, I was reduced to a stereotype in a matter of moments." The room grew silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. "I tell you this not for sympathy, but as a lesson. Leadership isn't just about power or titles. It's about standing up for justice, even in the face of adversity. It's about treating others with dignity and fairness, no matter who they are or where they come from." Anthony's words carried the raw truth of his experience, inspiring the young cadets to think beyond their roles as future leaders. As you go forward in life, remember, strength isn't just about what you fight against. It's about what you stand for. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Anthony's heart remained heavy. While he had turned the moment into a powerful lesson, he couldn't shake the lingering sadness for those who wouldn't have a Lieutenant Monroe to step in. As Anthony drove home under the setting sun, his mind replayed the events of the day. The crowd's cheers, the cadets' eager faces, and even Officer Harris's apology, all of it swirled together in a storm of conflicting emotions. He thought about Harris, the young officer who had let prejudice dictate his actions. Harris's apology had been genuine, but would it translate into meaningful change? Would he use this moment to challenge his biases, or would it fade away as just another incident in a deeply flawed system? Anthony pulled into his driveway and sat quietly in the car for a moment. He reflected on his own journey, how he had fought to rise above challenges, to serve his country with honor, to lead with integrity. Yet today had shown him that the battle for dignity and equality was far from over. Before stepping out of the car, Anthony made a decision. He would use his platform, his rank, and his voice to advocate for change. Not just in policing but in the broader fight against systemic injustice. As he walked into his home, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The battle he faced today was just one of many, but Anthony Reeves was a soldier, and soldiers never stop fighting for what is right.